The story takes place during World War I. A woodcarver named Geppetto lives happily in a small wooden house with his son, Carlo. One day, while they're in church together, a bomb suddenly falls from the sky and kills Carlo. Geppetto is heartbroken and spends all his time grieving by his son's grave. More than 20 years pass, and a pine tree grows next to the grave. A cricket named Sebastian, who is a writer, is traveling and decides to take a break in the hollow of the pine tree. That night, the tree suddenly starts moving. Sebastian investigates and finds a drunk Geppetto cutting down the tree. Geppetto takes the tree trunk home and soon carves it into a puppet. Exhausted, he falls asleep. That night, a blue fairy appears and, feeling sorry for Geppetto's loneliness, brings the puppet to life to be his son. She also grants Sebastian a wish and makes him the puppet's guardian. The puppet is named Pinocchio because he's made of pine wood. When Geppetto wakes up, he's shocked to find the puppet gone. He thinks a thief has broken into his house, but then he sees the puppet moving and talking to him. Pinocchio explains that his name is Pinocchio and that he's Geppetto's son, brought to life by the fairy. But Geppetto doesn't believe him at first. Pinocchio is still very naive, and his curiosity leads him to cause a lot of trouble around the house. Geppetto tells him to stay in a wooden cage for a while and not to go anywhere. Then he goes to church to pray. But Pinocchio doesn't listen and follows him to the church, causing a commotion. Pinocchio's nose grows longer every time he lies. Geppetto realizes that Pinocchio is disobedient and decides to send him to school to learn to be good. The next day, they go to repair the damaged church and meet a monkey named Spazzatura. Spazzatura discovers Pinocchio and tells his master, Count Volpe, about him. Pinocchio takes Carlo's schoolbook and sets off for school, but he meets Count Volpe on the way. Count Volpe tempts him with sweets and food, and despite Sebastian's warnings, Pinocchio signs a contract with Count Volpe and goes with him. Count Volpe takes Pinocchio to his circus, feeds him some snacks, and makes him perform for the children. He keeps all the money for himself and doesn't give Pinocchio any. Geppetto finds out about this and drags Pinocchio out of the circus. He compares him to his real son, Carlo, and scolds him for ruining the school book. Pinocchio tries to lie about breaking his school book, but his nose grows super long, revealing the truth. Geppetto and Count Volpe argue over Pinocchio, and in the struggle, Pinocchio gets hit by a car and dies. Pinocchio's soul goes to the afterlife, where he meets Death, the blue fairy's sister. Death explains that Pinocchio is immortal, so he can't die like humans. Every time he dies, he stays in the afterlife until an hourglass runs out, and then he comes back to life. But Death warns him that the more he dies, the longer he'll have to stay in the afterlife. Even though everyone thinks he's dead, Pinocchio comes back to life. Count Volpe shows him the contract and threatens him, saying he has to keep working for him or pay $10 million. When an army officer finds out Pinocchio is immortal, he wants him to join their military youth camp. He says they'll take care of the contract, but Geppetto refuses and chooses to pay the $10 million instead. Pinocchio, being naive, thinks war is fun and wants to join the army. Geppetto explains that war isn't fun at all. It causes a lot of death and destruction, and that's how his son Carlo died. Geppetto gets angry with Pinocchio for not listening and says hurtful things to him.
You are such a burden.
Pinocchio thinks his papa is angry with him because of the $10 million, so he decides to work for Count Volpe to pay it back. Despite his friend Cricket's protests, Pinocchio locks Cricket up and goes to Count Volpe. Pinocchio makes a deal with Count Volpe. He'll work for him, and in return, Count Volpe will forget about the money he owes and give half of his earnings to Geppetto. Count Volpe agrees immediately. Geppetto wakes up and Cricket tells him that Pinocchio has gone to the carnival to earn money. Geppetto and Cricket set off to find him. Pinocchio works hard to send money to his papa, but Count Volpe is dishonest and doesn't send any money to Geppetto. The sea route they're traveling is dangerous, and there's a huge monster called Dogfish, about the size of 20 ships. Geppetto is so desperate to find Pinocchio that he's not even afraid of being swallowed by the monster. He crosses the sea to the city where Pinocchio is performing. Unfortunately, he gets swallowed by the monster and is trapped inside. Pinocchio learns from a jealous monkey that Count Volpe is just using him like a puppet to make money. He gets angry and decides to team up with the monkey to ruin Count Volpe's business. During a performance, Pinocchio sings a song that mocks the leader, and he gets shot and dies again. He goes to the afterlife again to meet Death. Pinocchio is happy because he can die and come back to life. But Death tells him that even though he can live forever, his friends can die at any time. She tells him to cherish them while they're alive and sends him back to Earth. Pinocchio comes back to life and finds himself at a military recruit training camp with other kids. He learns that the leader, Podesta, took him there. At the camp, he becomes friends with Candlewick, Podesta's mistreated son. Podesta organizes a game as a test for the young soldiers. He divides them into two teams, one led by Pinocchio and the other by Candlewick. The game ends in a tie, so Podesta orders Candlewick to shoot Pinocchio. Candlewick refuses and argues with his father. Suddenly, enemy planes attack and Podesta is killed. Pinocchio escapes and accidentally runs into Count Volpe, who is now broke because of Pinocchio. Count Volpe captures him and tries to burn him alive. The monkey fights against Count Volpe and rescues Pinocchio. They all fall off a cliff into the sea, and Count Volpe dies. Pinocchio and the monkey survive, but they get swallowed by the dogfish monster. Inside the monster's belly, they find Geppetto, who has been trapped there for a long time. Following Cricket's advice, Pinocchio lies and makes his nose grow into a long branch. They use it as a bridge to climb out of the monster's blowhole. The dogfish tries to swallow them again, but Pinocchio sacrifices himself. He blows up a naval mine inside the dogfish, killing both the monster and himself. Pinocchio goes to the afterlife again. He wants to leave immediately to save Geppetto, who is drowning, but he has to wait for his hourglass to run out before he can come back to life. Death warns him that if he leaves before the hourglass runs out, he'll become mortal and die soon. Pinocchio has no choice, so he breaks the hourglass and leaves the afterlife. He saves Geppetto from drowning, but he dies and turns back into a wooden puppet. Geppetto is heartbroken and hugs the lifeless Pinocchio. The blue fairy appears and explains that Pinocchio sacrificed his life to save Geppetto. Sebastian reminds the blue fairy of her unfulfilled wish and asks her to save Pinocchio. The blue fairy keeps her promise and Pinocchio comes back to life again. Geppetto regrets his anger and selfishness, apologizes to Pinocchio, and from that day on, Pinocchio, Geppetto, Cricket, and the monkey live happily together in their small wooden house, helping and supporting each other. Many years later, everyone dies except Pinocchio, who sets off on an adventure to explore the world. And that's the end of the story.